Hey, how y'all doing? So today we'll just talk about terrorism. What a lovely topic, right? Really peaceful topic. Um, so uh, terrorism became really prominent in people's sort of consciousness, of course, after a major event, right? After 9/11. And not to say that prior to that we didn't have, terrorist acts. There was the bombing of the USS Cole prior to that. There was the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. Um, Believe it or not, the World Trade Center actually got attacked prior to 9/11. So you would have thought we would smart up a little bit then, right, after that. But, that happened. And then there was the taking of American hostages in Iran in 1979 after we overthrew their democratically elected uh, government 30 years before, which led to a fundamentalist regime, which led to the Shah of Iran and the taking of our hostages, right? So there's a long, a long history of terrorism, but a lot of misconceptions about why terrorism occurs, right? So since 9/11, there's been two major groups responsible for, quote, terrorism, right? Al Qaeda, right? And ISIS, which you guys have probably heard about, right? Two of the most prominent terrorist groups. And we're going to talk about them a little bit more in detail our next lecture. Okay, so we're not going to get into that today. Today, we're just going to sort of talk about what terrorism is, kind of how we define it, and the different types of terrorism. One is called asymmetric terrorism, and the other is called state terrorism. And you can't understand one without the other, right? So, what is terrorism really? Well, basically, terrorism is an act, right? And I'm going to argue that's carried out by individuals or states, right? With the intent to carry out violence in the furtherance of a political agenda. Okay? Right? So it's the attempt to carry out violence, like the deliberate act of violence, in the furtherance of a political agenda. Right? And usually this violence is aimed at civilians. Right? So the ones who end up dying in these horrific acts are people who had nothing to do with any of the fighting or the war or anything, right? Now, terrorism basically has two different kinds of terrorism. One is asymmetric terrorism. Asymmetric terrorism is the kind of terrorism carried out by non state actors. So you think like Al Qaeda or ISIS, which again, we'll talk about those two groups next lecture, right? Asymmetric terrorism is carried out by non state actors. Usually, the types of terrorism are non traditional, right? Acts of violence, right? So, for example, suicide bombings, which we associate with many of the Palestinian terrorist groups, like Hamas, right? They use very like dramatic, non-conventional acts of terrorism, and that would be like suicide bombings of buses, for example, laying down IEDs, which have been horrifically used, of course, by many of the Iraqi fighters against the United States. The IEDs were a popular use of violence that was carried out. Another example of asymmetric terrorism would be what happened on 9/11. Hijackers flying planes into the World Trade Centers and into the attempted one into the Pentagon, so we were told. And so asymmetric terrorism just basically unconventional acts carried out by non-state actors. Okay. State terrorism, as you could probably guess, is the type of terrorism carried out by governments. Oh no, he's going there. Can governments carry out terrorism? Absolutely, right? In fact, I'm going to argue that if you want to understand asymmetric terrorism, again, the terrorism carried out by non state actors, Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda, ISIS, they're all examples of really asymmetric. You have to understand state terrorism. So state terrorism, again, is acts of violence carried out for a political agenda, and it's aimed at civilians. Well, let's use that definition. You could look at Adolf Hitler, right? What Hitler did, the most extreme example in Nazi Germany, was certainly an act of terrorism, right? There's no other way to look at that. He had a political agenda. He carried out violence. It was aimed at civilians, right? Happened to be the Jewish population, the gay population, the gypsies, all of his political opponents. He carried out acts of terror in furtherance of an agenda. But because we call them a government, right, we don't associate that with terrorism, right? That couldn't be further from the truth, right? Just because you're a government doesn't mean you can't carry out acts of terrorism. Many would argue that what the United States has done in the Middle East, the first Persian Gulf War, the second war in Iraq, which was totally against all international opinion, Israel's brutal occupation of Palestine, so much is focused on the Palestinian terrorist acts against the Israelis. No one ever stops to consider, well, what's Israel doing? Isn't Israel engaged in terrorism too? I mean, they legally occupy the Palestinian territories. They torture many Palestinians routinely. They carry out targeted assassinations of Palestinian leaders. That would qualify as terrorism, right? As unpopular as it may seem. I hate to bring this up, guys. America's use of atom bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But is that an act of state terrorism? Violence in furtherance of a political agenda aimed at civilians? Sounds like we carried out terrorism during World War II, right? As did China, as did the United States, as did Japan, right? As did Great Britain, as did Germany, of course, and Russia, right? So we have asymmetric terrorism, again, unconventional acts of violence carried out by non-state actors. And yes, those acts are very horrific. And then state terrorism, the type of terrorism carried out by governments. And their acts can be horrific. Now, does anybody want to guess where I'm going with this? Okay. Well, in our country, right, and in many Western nations, when we talk about terrorism, we only talk about asymmetric terrorism. It's as if we're cutting off the other half. So what does that do? If we don't talk about state terrorism and we only talk about asymmetric terrorism, then it becomes really difficult to understand why terrorism may happen in the first place, right? So when we see an asymmetric act, like people flying, crazy people flying planes into buildings, like what happened on 9/11, we think, well, those guys must be maniacs. And they are maniacs, of course, but it must be a totally out of the blue act. Why would anyone fly planes into buildings? Well, if we don't talk about state terrorism, it makes absolutely no sense. However, if we bring state terrorism back into the equation, and then we look at why do people fly planes into the buildings, and state terrorism is now part of that equation, we can then guess what? Well, maybe those actions, and not to say they're okay, guys, not justifying it, maybe the flying of planes into the trade centers and into the Pentagon was retaliation for acts of state terrorism that maybe America engaged in. Oh man, yikes. So is there anything, and we'll end the clip here, is there anything the United States has done in the Middle East in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s that may have been a trigger for 9/11? And that's what that one article you read by Chalmers Johnson, Blowback. He kind of argued that 9/11 was a response for something that we've done over there, right? The term is called blowback, right? The blowback theory. So We're going to get into the blowback theory in more detail next class, and we'll talk about how the blowback theory explains the rise of Al-Qaeda, and it also explains the rise of ISIS. So basically, those two groups came out of the state terrorism, right? So you guys be well. Much peace.